Oral History Criminology Project, in conjunction with the American Society of Criminology, is pleased to present a conversation with Franklin E. Zimring, coming to you November 18th, 2016, from the annual meetings of the American Society of Criminology here in New Orleans. Just a brief bit of background on Professor Zimring before we begin the discussion of his life and his career and the contents of his academic contributions. Began his academic and scholarly work with a BA with distinction at Wayne State University. From there, he enrolled at the University of Chicago, earning a JD cum laude in 1967. Currently serves as the William G. Simon Professor of Law, the Wolfen Distinguished Scholar and Chair of the Criminal Justice Research Program, the Institute for Legal Research, which was formerly the Earl Warren Legal Institute at Boalt Hall School of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. He also serves as the director of the Earl Warren Legal Institute, had served as the director from 1983 to 2002. He's faculty of law prior to that at the University of Chicago from 1967 to 1985. He also held the Carl N. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence from 1975 to 1985. Also serving as director at the University of Chicago with the Center of Studies in Criminal Justice during that same time period. Over the course of his career, he's also held a number of other posts. He's been a principal investigator of the Center on Culture, Immigration, and Youth Violence Prevention from 2005, and he's currently member of the MacArthur Foundation Research Program on Adolescent Development and Juvenile Justice, 1997 to 2007. He's fellow of the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, 1979 to 80. Director of Research, the Task Force on Firearms, National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence from in 1968 and 9. He's had a number of visiting professorships over the course of the years as well, places like the University of California at Irvine, University of South Africa, the University of California at Berkeley, Yale University, as well as the University of Pennsylvania. He served as an advisor and dozens and dozens of posts, consultant positions, and editorial board appointments galore as well. Over the course of his career, he's earned a number of the signal distinctions within the field of criminology. More specifically, the Edwin H. Sutherland Award was bestowed on him in 2007, the August Vollmer Award from the ASC in 2006, the Pass Award from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency in 1999, the Donald Cressy Award was earned in 1995 from the National Council on Crime and Delinquency, the Paul Tappan Award from the Western Society of Criminology, and he's also a fellow of the American Society of Criminology as of 1993. Has a number of research interests, including youth violence, crime trends, correctional policy, capital punishment, firearms research, international and comparative, penal philosophy. It's a rather abbreviated list. 30 books and monographs, nearly 150 scholarly articles, translations into Chinese, Italian, and Korean. Written a number of books: Deterrence with Gordon Hawkins in 1976, Capital Punishment and the American Agenda, 1987, The Scale of Imprisonment, also with Gordon Hawkins in 1993, Crime is Not the Problem, co-authored with Gordon Hawkins in 1999, American Youth Violence in 1998, The Contradictions of American Capital Punishment, which was earned the notable book of the year from The Economist in 2003, The Great American Crime Decline in 2006, The City That Became Safe in 2011, and currently completing work about to be published, When Police Kill, from Harvard University Press. Before you begin the process of kind of engaging in this kind of scholarship, I think it's important to kind of set the scene in a little bit of way in terms of your own identity. You kind of refer to yourself as a lawyer criminologist, and
my scholarly career has been hyphenated.
Okay.
And that is to say, my graduate training, with the exception of 1 year in the Department of Sociology at the University of California at Berkeley, was all in law. But it was at the University of Chicago between 1964 and 1967 when Chicago had become a hotbed of empirical research in legal institutions and the effects of legal doctrine. Hans Zeisel and Harry Calvin were just completing, when I became a law student at Chicago, a book called The American Jury, which is still the classic empirical study of the effects of juries on legal decision-making in the United States. And Zeisel became one of 2 or 3 mentors of great importance to my career. Norval Morris, who has a PhD in criminology that had been granted by the University of London in the middle of the 20th century, 1950, was also a lawyer. He had founded the Department of Criminology at the University of Melbourne, but he was a law professor as well and dean at the University of Adelaide. He visited at Harvard and then joined the Chicago faculty as a professor of criminal law and as the director of a new center Ford was funding called the Center for Studies in Criminal Justice at the University of Chicago. That was one of 5 empirical research centers of studies in criminal justice that the Ford Foundation had created. And it became the basis for my training and my research, and also the first research administration I ever did. I was the first employee of that center. When I finished my legal studies, I was appointed to the Chicago Law faculty directly, the first time that had ever happened, and I became a research associate at the center. All of the empirical stuff that other people would write grant proposals to do, all I had to do was to type a memo to Norval Morris, ask for money, and by the time I was collecting the data, other people were waiting to find out what was happening with their grant approvals. It was a fabulous setting to learn a lot and to take risks and do empirical research. The center's copious funding meant that Norval Morris could hire another criminologist, a man by the name of Hans Maddock, as an associate director. Maddock had been an associate warden of the Cook County Jail, had been in charge of doing empirical research on social and delinquency prevention stuff, and also was the cause in fact for the first major empirical research I ever did. In 1967, he threw at me a copy of the Chicago Police Department's homicide reports for the previous year. And he said, homicide in Chicago between 1965 and 1966 and 1967 had jumped about 29%. And he said, homicide statistics don't do that. Something's going on that we don't understand. Go find out. And as a young law review editor and about to be assistant professor of law, what I thought was perhaps we could use statistics on violence as a sort of a case study. In the same sense that when an appellate court would produce a case, you'd analyze it, you'd write a case note on it. I began to think, let's write a case note on what happens to patterns of homicide in Chicago as rates of homicide change. So we got started on that enterprise. I thought it would take about a year. I was off by 7 years. My research assistant was a young graduate student named Richard Block. Now, one of the sort of funny blessings I've had in later life was the opportunity to serve as the principal speaker at the retirement dinner of my first research assistant. That's when you know you're getting old.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of questions here. One is sort of biographical in a bit of a way. Is this what drew you to Chicago? Did you have already a pronounced interest in crime and criminal justice?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I thought in my pre-law phases that I was going to be a practicing lawyer and not an academic lawyer. And I thought it would be in criminal justice. All of my emotional instincts were with the defense, so my ambition was to become an elected district attorney, because I was precocious enough to realize where all the power lay in criminal justice. And if you really wanted to reform the system and you were asking, guess what to do? Well, the problem with that is I can't get elected to anything, let alone district attorney. And there is another problem that I have in terms of the limits and the nature of my capacities. There are a lot of jobs I'd be terrible at, and there's one job I would be very good at. And in a funny sense, that's very liberating, because you don't have a lot of difficult decisions to make. I'm pretty good at what I do.
Yeah.
I don't want to stop doing it. I do want to get to be able to do it better, but I've never had to think, my God, what about all the lives I didn't lead? Because most of them would have been disastrous.
What was it that made you alert to the possibility that I could be an academic?
Oh, it was very simple. My first year at the University of Chicago Law School, I had won something called the Meacham Prize Scholarship to go to Chicago. I knew it was a very good school. I didn't know anything else about it. Most people who go to law school don't have the slightest idea what they are enrolling in. But my first year faculty that year in Chicago was the most exciting group of teachers and of people I could ever imagine. The criminal law course was split by two people. Norval Morris, who became my second closest friend in life and mentor, and Francis Allen, another mentor, who was perhaps the best classroom law teacher that existed in any subject at any school in the United States. It was a completely captivating universe. I had Malcolm Sharp for contracts. I had Harry Calvin, the co-author of The American Jury, as my torts teacher. I was under the illusion for about 15 years that torts was a very exciting subject because Calvin was a very exciting teacher. But he could have made cream chip beef on toast into a fascinating subject intellectually. Jeffrey Hazard was teaching civil procedure, and all of a sudden the smartest people in the room were law teachers. And I was probably one of the loudest law students in the history of legal education. It got so bad that when some years later I was giving a lecture series at the University of Michigan, Francis Allen, who was then a senior professor at Michigan and had been the dean there, introduced my second lecture by telling a story of coming to class with books in the middle of my first year in law school, and an anonymous colleague of his, who I'm pretty sure was Jeffrey Hazard, saying, "You'd better be prepared, Frank. Frank Zimring may call on you today." So I had a very exciting first year in law school and a great law school career. By the middle of my first year in law school, Norval Morris tossed me a typescript of the proposal to build the Center for Studies in Criminal Justice and said, "Would you like to work for us?" And I said, "People get paid to do this? Of course I'd work for them." Well, my project that summer, this is 1965, was to collect all of what mankind knew about deterrence. So I never was in a doctoral studies program, but I did write a dissertation. The dissertation was a monograph called Perspectives on Deterrence that then became a book that I co-authored with Gordon Hawkins called Deterrence, the Legal Threat in Crime Control. Because Norval Morris had promised the Ford Foundation that if they gave him $1 million, he'd give them the first book in the English language on deterrence. It was what was called vicarious compliance.
Where are you picking up the empirical element? It doesn't sound like it was a formal part of your training.
Well, it wasn't a formal part of my training, but it was a very important part of every significant topic in criminal justice and criminology.
Yeah.
The deterrent effect, if any, of the threats of criminal punishment. How on earth do you study that? If you don't study it empirically, then you really are studying theology instead of the impact of doctrine. So there were factual questions in every significant issue, and the less that you could directly infer on good policy from what you believed, the more important the facts got to be. When the homicide rate jumps 29%, unless God speaks to you, you'd better do some empirical research to find out what patterns of homicide are changing when the homicide rates change. So you become, on the installment plan, an empirical scholar, and it's going to have to be on-the-job training because you're going to learn the methods as you investigate the specific issues. Let's take that little case note that I was going to write on homicide. Well, if I'm going to write a case note on homicide in Chicago, I better find out what the scholarship is on homicide in sociology or criminology. So I pick up a book that Marvin Wolfgang has written called Patterns in Criminal Homicide. He does 5 years of homicides in Philadelphia, and he writes a classic empirical study that was published in 1958. And while I'm reading it, I come across an absolutely remarkable assertion that Marvin made. He said, "Look, now that we've studied all these homicides, one thing that we know is that the choice of weapon in homicide has no influence on deaths. Sure, guns are frequent, but knives can kill, clubs can kill. As long as there's something around so that his destructive goal can be met, the killer will succeed." Well, there were two problems with that immediately presented themselves to a young law student. One is that, unlike Marvin, I'd taken a course in criminal law, and I knew that the mental state that convicts you of murder is not the intent to kill. It is what's called malice, the intent to kill or do grievous bodily harm. So anybody who shoots or stabs or clubs is going to be a murderer if death results, as long as the attack was intentional. But the other thing that I realized is that Wolfgang had made a classic sampling error. The death rate of the case sample in patterns of criminal homicide was 100%. But how many attacks didn't kill? And what were the differences between the attacks that did kill and the attacks that didn't kill? And in understanding Wolfgang's sampling error, we also generated what would be the methodology of the homicide, weapons, and wounding. We took the two most life-threatening weapons used in personal attacks in the city of Chicago. They were guns and knives. And we took not just attacks that killed, but all attacks, to find out what was the death rate per 100 assaults, and what was the overlap between assaults that killed and assaults that didn't kill. And so, in a sense, I was directly in the debt of Marvin Wolfgang's mistake to come up with the design. Now, you find out you never run your life, events run your lives. We prepared a press release on the homicide, weapons, and wounding study in June of 1968. And that was 2 days before Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And 1 week before Lyndon Johnson appointed a national commission on the causes and prevention of violence that would be directed by a man named Lloyd Cutler, a prominent attorney in Washington, who would hire 2 directors of research, and they would be Marvin Wolfgang and James Short. And they would appoint directors of task forces on several key issues. And one of those issues was guns. But we'd just done a press release on the first serious empirical study of firearms and violence in the 20th century history of the United States. So all of a sudden, age 24, I met Lloyd Cutler, and I met Marvin Wolfgang, and I met James Short, and it was off to Washington as an assistant professor of law on leave of absence for a while to do an awful lot of research on firearms and violence in 7 months' time. We did it. I had a lot of help from my friends, including Hans Zeisel, whose jury study had just been published. And of course, I had wonderful conversations with Marvin Wolfgang, later a friend and a colleague when I visited the University of Pennsylvania, and Jim Short, who had co-authored Homicide and Suicide in the mid-1950s, and I'm sure is on tape in your collection. And it was a great adventure. It was also terrifying because I knew what I didn't know, and I just wondered whether the people running the Defense Department were as ill-equipped as we were to answer the questions that had been dumped in our lap. I have reason to worry about that again as we're talking in 2016.
How much correspondence is there between the legal realm and the policy realm and the empirical realm? Is there much conversation, or are you a lonely voice? Is this something that's growing and emerging, or?
It grew and emerged for a while, and parts of it have emerged better than other parts of it has emerged. Law and economics, particularly at the University of Chicago, was dominant, and law and economics has an empirical wing. It also has a very theoretical wing where you don't bother them with the facts. They know what they are, so they don't have to investigate them. But they do have, and there are law professors who are serious statistical students, but they also tend to have PhDs in economics. Justin McCrary, who is my colleague, John Donahue at Stanford and Yale has been prominent and very good at this work. So there is, in the empirics of criminal justice impact, there's a young man named Jonathan Pfaff, who's now at Fordham University in the law school, who does that kind of work. There are also people who get PhDs in legal studies subjects. I'm now at Berkeley on the doctoral faculty of jurisprudence and social policy. One of my first doctoral students there, and Jerry Skolnick, I believe, headed, or was it Shelley Messenger, his PhD committee, was Jonathan Simon, who's now a professor at Berkeley and also director of the Center for the Study in Law Society. There is a journal of empirical legal studies, which comes out of Cornell University. So empirical study has a presence in the pantheon of legal scholarship. It is not in any sense, however, dominant. And there are a lot of topics where the number of experts is nobody. Police killings, which I hope we'll talk about in a while, turned out to be one of those topics. Where the leading experts on killings, police use of lethal force in 2015 in the United States was absolutely nobody. That's pretty stunning. How many people are attending the Criminology conference here?
3,000 or 4,000.
3,000 or 4,000? How many of those have done studies of police use of fatal force? You will use the fingers, but not your toes, and you may not need your left hand. That's astonishing, and it's not good news. No better in legal studies.
So I listed off, I did my best in terms of collapsing your CV into sort of thematic areas. And I suppose that there's sort of an academic inclination to put things in boxes and things of that nature. Are you putting things in boxes with the various aspects of the various threads of your research?
Sure.
Or is there one unifying thing?
Well, no, first of all, you see, when you ask, are you a criminologist or a law professor? What I say about criminal justice is that it is a topic. It isn't a discipline. It isn't a methodology. It's a subject matter. I put my scholarly interests in subject matter packages. The jurisprudence and empirics of juvenile justice and youth violence and juvenile courts has produced 5 or 6 books and some subtopics that I got interested in off of understanding adolescent behavior and the legal institutions that respond to it as quite different from adult behavior. So I've written books on the jurisprudence of juvenile justice. I've written books on American youth violence. I've written books on sentencing young offenders. And then in 2004, with all this MacArthur money, I created a book series where we could commission books and pay a lot for them and get a leading expert to write a book. And I got from my board of editors a series of topics where we needed that kind of book. One of them was on the overlap of serious mental illness and juvenile justice problematics. we found an expert, and he wrote a book on it called Double Jeopardy. Everybody agreed that a book had to be done on juvenile sex offenders. And all we had to do was to find in the United States of America, population 315 million people, one expert on juvenile justice who'd studied sex offenders. There weren't any. So I commissioned me. I had a great deal of background in juvenile justice policy and its institutions and its strategic importance. I had no background in juvenile sex offenses. I asked Tom Grisso, who had written the Double Jeopardy book for us, a psychologist and deep expert on juvenile pathologies. I said, Tom, you're doing the serious mental illness book. Why don't you just do a chapter on juvenile sex offenders in it? And he said, Frank, I think you're going to find that they're a completely different population. And boy, was he right. They don't have serious mental or emotional problems. There's no such thing as a juvenile pedophile. There are an awful lot of boys you don't want to hire as babysitters when they're 14 because they're terribly interested in sex and don't know a goddamn thing about it. But that's a very different world than the world that people had been assuming it was. So all of a sudden I had to write a book, and it was called An American Travesty, and it was on legal policy toward adolescent sex offenders. So that's the juvenile offenses and juvenile justice institutions box, and it's an important one. Then there's the violence box. Life-threatening violence and its relationship to crime, social structures, criminal justice initiatives. A whole series of things. Most of the gun stuff grows out of that interest and created Firearms and Violence in American Life, a later edition of which, with Gordon Hawkins, was called The Citizen's Guide to Gun Control. But it also was a handle on coming to understand various structures of crime and criminal justice control. It produced an international set of comparisons that led to a book published in 1987 called About America, Crime is Not the Problem, Lethal Violence in America. So that was life-threatening violence and criminal justice policy and international comparisons coming together for a very important kind of valedictory study. I had a deep and very emotional connection to the topic of capital punishment, and therefore didn't do major publications on the death penalty in the United States for the first 15 or 20 years of my career. Then, starting with Capital Punishment in the American Agenda that was published in 1987, and continuing to a book that I wrote in 2003 by myself. The American Agenda book was with Gordon Hawkins, and I hope we'll talk a little bit about that collaboration later on. I wrote a book called The Contradictions of American Capital Punishment that came out in 2003, which is really all I had to say on American capital punishment. And it was a lot to say about it. That was where the linkage between state proclivities toward capital punishment and state proclivities toward lynching was first developed in American social science, and there's been some follow-up studies after that. That was also a very serious policy study on how it happened in the United States and why it happened in the United States. It led me into work on what I call penal federalism, the fact that other countries have the national government decide things like whether they execute prisoners. We have provincial governments decide it. We don't have a criminal justice system in the United States. We have 51 different systems. And there's more difference in capital punishment policy. There's as much difference between the history and current policy in Minnesota and the history and current policy in Texas as there is between the history and current policy of capital punishment in Norway and the history and current policy toward capital punishment in Iraq. So federalism is enormously important, and I'm still writing on that. So capital punishment is now another major subject matter box. The last big study I did on that, I did with David Johnson, a professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii, but one of our JSP PhDs in the 1990s. And he was an expert on Japan. And we wrote a huge book called The Next Frontier, which was on national development and the death penalty in Asia. We actually did an author meets sort of critics session on that book at the Criminology meetings. It wasn't attended by a cast of thousands because there weren't many people who had backgrounds in the subject. Is it an important topic? Oh, good heavens, yes. And it is important, although most Americans don't do it, to put the whole subject of state killing in a transnational perspective. That's one reason why I have no temptations to retire. Because I do not feel that in the topics that interest and engage me, that I'm being followed around by a cast of thousands. I have had, during the years at Berkeley, and it was a great improvement on the years at the University of Chicago, the opportunity to produce PhDs. That's as close to reproduction as we can now come in this era of sexual harassment sensitivity in American academic life. And I am, particularly over the last 8 or 9 years, more intensely concentrating my efforts on doctoral students and creating dissertation research to continue some of these threads.
Are there any biographical reference to these academic interests? You mentioned a deep emotional commitment to capital
the death
punishment.
penalty, yes. There would be one. I grew up in Southern California, and the day that the local Hearst afternoon newspaper in 1953 published a front page picture of Ethel Rosenberg in the electric chair. It was Dr. Johnson who said about the prospects of being killed in 2 weeks' time that it concentrates the mind wonderfully. My attitudes toward capital punishment, which I'm sure has an awful lot to do with family values as well, were focused very much on the California of the mid-1950s. the place where Barbara Graham's execution became the basis for a film called I Want to Live. I grew up in Hollywood in the film industry. My father was a Hollywood writer with the personality of a college professor. I've been accused of being a college professor with the personality of a Hollywood writer. But that was an interest in the death penalty that was so strong that I stayed away from it for a long time as an academic engagement. I waited until I was sure that I had something to say that was independent of my passions. Because I'm just not an expert on a lot of things that I care about. I love my wife deeply. I don't understand her. And if you don't believe me, just ask her.
Looking back over all the numerous things that you produced over the entirety of your career, is there one, or is there a theme? Is there a couple of articles that cohere around a specific aspect of an agenda that you look back on in terms of that's what I'd like kids in a future generation to pick up?
Well, they're two separate questions.
Sure.
Number one, what is it that I've been good at doing?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then
yeah.
the other is
All right.
where should it lead? And what I am never very good at writing the 38th book on any topic or doing the 38th study, but improving it in some detail. What I'm good at is organizing fields that haven't been organized, getting the sequence of questions right, and asking the initial organizing questions. So that, for instance, the when police kill question. Okay, what is it that we have to know?
Yeah.
How can we find out? How do you define the topic? And it turns out in a very different way. We've been studying killings by police over here and killings of police over there, as if they're two different topics, and they're not. But that's the kind of thing that first books on the topic can do
I
to
see
organize
the deterrence book. I think really gets that.
Yeah. Indeed.
Yeah.
What are the questions and what do we call it?
Yeah.
What is deterrence? Well, to begin with, folks, what we're talking about here is the legal threat in crime control. Is that the same thing as saying, I'll take my basketball and go home? No, it does involve stigma, and it does involve government and certain other things and social values. So you have to start there by organizing what the questions are, calling them names, identifying what the serious issues are. And that's something that I do well. And there are a lot of places where it needs doing, so it keeps me employed. Now, there are other things that I'm dreadful at. Fix up the references. Get the literature right. Well, one wonderful thing that happened to me was meeting a man much my elder in 1967 at the University of Chicago, whose name was Gordon Joseph Hawkins. Hawkins had been a graduate student in philosophy after the war. He'd been a captain in the Indian Army during World War II. He had been a student of philosophy who had to feed his family, so he went to work for the British prison system. And one of the things he did was to create prison training programs. And the other thing was he would be the host for distinguished visitors who'd come to England. And they'd always get drunk with Gordon, and they'd always say, you really ought to come teach at our university. One of them was Dean John Chatwell from the University of Sydney. And he not only said that drunk, but he then wrote a letter sober and said, how would you like to found an Institute for Criminology at the University of Sydney? So he did. But he was in his 40s, and he was a long married man with 3 children by then, went down to Australia, and then on his first sabbatical, wrote a letter to Norval Morris at the University of Chicago, who was the most prominent person in criminology in Australia as well, and said, I'd like to spend the year there, studying life imprisonment. And Norval tossed me the letter and said, what do you think of this? And I said, I like the man, the project is a dog. Well, that first year, and Gordon was 49 when I met him, I was 24. In that first year, we started making the monograph that I wrote by myself, Perspectives on Deterrence, into the Deterrence book, which was the major deliverable that Norval had promised to the Ford Foundation. But then on his Tuesday nights, he and Norval Morris, with a fair amount of wine consumed, got to work on the chapters for a little book that became The Honest Politician's Guide to Crime Control. The only volume of criminological work ever to sell 100,000 copies. So, and that was 1967. Gordon was also very funny. He gave a presentation in 1968 at the law school faculty dinner, explaining what he was doing at the law school. And as I said, he was very entertaining. And so he said, he described his career, and then he said to my colleagues on the faculty, and then I came to the University of Chicago Law School, and I met Frank Zimring, and my plans suffered a setback. And he said, now I mean that phrase, suffered a setback, in the same sense as the author of the Criminal Law Review article in Britain, who said, in 1963, the marriage suffered a setback when the husband killed the wife. Gordon and I got along fine. I said that Norval Morris was my second best friend in life. Norval Morris became that because Gordon Hawkins was my very best friend and a member of my family for many years after that. When the opportunity to switch from the south side of Chicago to the north side of Berkeley came up in 1983, and I visited for 2 years at Berkeley before I cut the cord, I said to Gordon, listen, you can come for the summer, and you can choose if you want to go back to Chicago, I'll work with you there, where I'm on leave of absence, or if you want to go to Berkeley, we can work here. He said, I don't need much time to decide that. And that became the first of 17 consecutive North American summers that Hawkins spent with the Earl Warren Legal Institute at the University of California. He had been retired as of January 1st, 1984. Well, he turned 65 then, from the Australian academic system. It was compulsory. Between that time and his last trip in the year 2000, we published 8 books together. Capital Punishment in the American Agenda, Pornography in a Free Society, The Citizen's Guide to Gun Control, a book that was published in 1991 called The Scale of Imprisonment. That was back before mass incarceration was invented in criminological confabs. but it was a serious issue then. A book called Incapacitation, The Crime is Not the Problem book, and a book called Punishment and Democracy, which is on 3 strikes and you're out in California. It was a wonderful collaboration. Gordon was great in the libraries, had read everything and comprehended it. I could organize things. We enjoyed each other's company so much. A lot of those books were written on the pool deck of the Claremont Pool and Tennis Club, where I'd dictate a first draft, then we'd swim, then we'd go to my house, give him a very tall beer, and he would edit that manuscript, which would then go in for typing the next day. And if that's the way you're doing your work and you're enjoying it, you don't work 5 days a week, you work 7 days a week. What exactly would you like to do to play if that's work? So it was a wonderful, and it was great for him because he essentially did more work, more high quality scholarship in his retirement than in his academic career. That's wonderful when you don't have students to worry about.
Sure. You mentioned the Honest Politician's Guide, and your Vita actually dedicates several pages. I've never seen this yet. I've read dozens and dozens of these. It was line after line after line of op-ed or something there that reaches beyond the academic border into attempting to tap into public consciousness.
These are policy questions, and policy questions are political questions there. And what I had to do early in my law career, I had been much more as a student in secondary education and college, and even in law school, I was a much more compelling speaker than a writer. And it was just easier for me to do it that way. Writing is hard, all this stuff with subjects and predicates. But writing is also quite necessary. And there's an enormous number of op-ed things. I did quite a bit of that at Chicago, mostly with the Chicago Tribune before I left. Then a vast amount with the Los Angeles Times, back when that was a newspaper. And then actually with the San Francisco Chronicle in more recent years. And a lot of those essays are on crime and justice issues. A lot of them aren't on crime and justice issues. Some of them are on government, but some of the stuff is on other stuff. I did a piece in Newsweek on being an ex-smoker. I did a piece in the New York Times in the late 80s on being a frequent flyer club member. And one of the things that I had been putting off trying to do, but had as a long-term ambition, was to put out a little volume of these essays on personal matters. And that also happened in 2015. It's a little volume called Memos from Midlife, essays on personal issues. And I like that very much. And I've become a good writer in relatively simple and declarative terms. And the way you do that is because it takes a lot of practice. So the more practice you get, the better things can get. But again, it's something that I enjoy. Not that it isn't work, but it's the kind of work that makes me feel that a day hasn't been wasted.
Yeah. Well, it's public intellectual work in a bit of a way, right? A lot of this
sure.
does seem to be sort of how to communicate the importance of social scientific research to sort of a lay audience.
Well, and not just social science research. I'll give you one example. The very last thing that was published in that 2015 book, much more recent than some of the stuff on parenting. I mean, my children are now turning 47 and 46. I have a tenured child. It was a little piece that was called The Invisible Blessings of Prevention. And it started with three statistical stories that nobody really understood. One of them was on the death rate from heart attacks for middle-aged men. In the mid-1950s, that's something that happened a lot. By the mid-2000s, the death rate from heart attacks between ages 45 and 54 had gone down 83%. Now, what was it that caused that? Well, a lot of stuff. People were doing a lot less smoking. There was an emphasis on finding and treating blood pressure. Mm-hmm. There were changes in diet and all. But it was an incredible kind of health benefit. Nobody knew about it. Particularly the people whose lives were saved didn't know that their lives were saved. Let's talk traffic now. We'll talk traffic risks per 100,000 miles driven. That rate also went down between 1955 and 2010 by 83%. There are fewer people killed and 5 times as much driving done. Now, what single phenomenon? No, there are a lot of different things did that. Seat belts, padded steering wheels, divided highways instead of those. But again, the people whose lives were saved don't know who they are and don't write thank you notes. So when you talk about the invisible blessings of prevention, we're coming to a political problem in a moment. But before the political problem, let's talk about air travel. I know it was never terribly dangerous, but in the early 1960s, there were a fair number of air crashes. And when you compare the rate per million miles flown in the early 1960s with the rate now, the death rate is down by 95%. Well, that's not chopped liver. But again, the people whose planes don't crash don't know who they are. And the problem with the invisibility of these benefits of prevention is they're not a lobby for it. And they may very well say, waste the taxpayers' money to build that divided highway that just saved my life, but I don't know it. So that there is a dangerous political flaw there. So is that public intellectual work? Yeah. Is it any less linked to what I've been doing professionally than something that I would write on the death penalty? I don't think so. I think it's part of the same game. And it's a game that I enjoy playing and that I've learned a lot from.
Some of your more recent work has done these things where you kind of take a broad look particular phenomenon, and you're kind of the one that's invited in. Could you talk to us a little bit about the success of how you kind of bring all that in and make sense of these kinds of like the annals and the crime and justice pieces that you've done over the course of time?
Well, in general, first of all, what happens then is generally there's a sort of a matrimonial dispute.
Oh, okay.
Between me and an editor. And the editor will say something, Mike Connery is Mr. Think Big.
Yeah.
Say, think big. And I say, well, yeah, but before I do, there are a few things I'd like to find out.
All right.
So it is a bit of a tug of war on scale. And it really depends, for me, in writing it, on what I know. In a couple of areas, particularly on juvenile justice, there are a couple of books that I've been editing and producing in the last 2 or 3 years on juvenile justice with a co-editor who's a generation younger than I am. You start a book series at my age, you'd better have somebody who's a generation younger. And he's David Tannenhouse, a legal historian. And a good example of big picture, and then the question is, why the big picture now, is the essay that we did in a long edited volume called Juvenile Justice in Global Perspective. And that is to say, systems all over the world. Now, comparative juvenile justice used to be compare the United States with Japan and England. That isn't the whole world. There are places like India, the People's Republic of China. There is, I'm told, a continent down there called South America. Try reading something on South American juvenile justice. Can't find it. Okay, you can now. But then my senior co-editor, comparative law professor, who is Argentinian by birth, and I wrote a final chapter about what is the nature. You see, every system in the world, other than the 4 Scandinavian countries, has 2 courts for burglars. If the burglar is over 18, he goes to criminal court. If the burglar is 16, he goes to juvenile court. Now, I can understand having different punishment policies for young offenders, but you don't need different courts to have different punishment policies. Barry Feld made a career out of suggesting that. Well, just have the same policy, a different policy, but in the same court. But that's not what's done. And I'll tell you why that's not done. One reason we're more lenient with young offenders is because they deserve less punishment. It's a question of penal desert, diminished responsibility on the count of immaturity. And that's very important if you kill 3 people. And that means you can't get the death penalty if you're not 18 yet. Even in Alabama. Okay, but that isn't something that needs a separate court. What the separate court is about is not giving people their just deserts. It is a different policy toward youth crime that looks toward different preventive outcomes. The best known cure for youth crime is growing up. Now, that's interesting, and you need some statistical acumen to realize that, because in a funny sense, 16-year-old burglars, if you let them out and don't send them to prison, are more likely to be arrested in the next year rather than less likely to be arrested in the next year than 24-year-old burglars or 32-year-old burglars. But that isn't the measure. What you're doing is letting them grow up. That takes a while. But when it happens, it creates much lower crime rates. They stop hanging out with other guys. They start hanging out with significant others. They start working for a living. Terrible things happen to adults. And so the strategy of the juvenile court is giving unjust leniency because it has a maturation policy. Now that's a very big picture.
Yeah.
Who has said that in formal theoretical terms before that was written was nobody. I talked about a diversion program, but diversion toward what? And the distinction between just and non-justice interventions, and that's the only reason you need a separate court. Because if you're giving lack of criminal justice to those 17-year-olds, and the next burglar in line is 26, he says, wait a minute, why don't I get what Eddie got? And if you're the judge, you're going to have to give him a pretty long and convoluted answer. Much better to have a separate court. Why didn't I know that 25 years ago to write it that way? Well, it takes practice.
Now, I suppose over the course of your career, you may have been involved with arguments or back and forth or debate on particular topics. Could you maybe provide a couple of examples or an illustrative example and give us an idea how that shook out?
I get involved in debates when I think enormously irresponsible things are being said and when people assert that they can prove things that they can't prove. I am famous for a few interesting statistical forays. I'll give two examples of this from the 1980s. One I did with Gordon Hawkins when I was down on the beach with him in Sydney, because if he comes up for North American summers, I had to go down for literary stuff. He lived in Manly, Australia, which is on one side of the beach and on the other side of the bay, in December and January. And this was paid for by the University of California at Berkeley. God bless them. Okay. Ed Zedlewski of the National Institute of Justice had, using a Peter Greenwood data set, said, each year of imprisonment prevents 187 crimes, and therefore each year of imprisonment actually has public benefits of $570,000. And Chip Stewart, I think, wrote an introduction to this. So Hawkins and I then did the following after I did the calculations. Under those circumstances, this was 1988, if we took the additional prisoners who had been put in prison between, say, we were writing a book called The Scale of Imprisonment that does this sort of thing, at 187 crimes per each additional prisoner, we calculated that the crime rate between 1970 and 1982 should have gone to zero and should now be 500,000 crimes below zero. That piece was called The New Mathematics of Imprisonment. I guess you could call that getting involved in a debate.
Yeah.
The next time it happened was in the 1995-1996 debates about juvenile super predators. John DiIulio had done a set of birth statistics calculations which suggested that between 1995 and 2010, there would be an extra 210,000 juvenile super predators on the streets. And so we better start building prisons pretty quick. The analysis I'm about to describe was published in the Los Angeles Times under the headline, "Desperados in Diapers." And the reason it was, is that here was Dooley's math. The total youth population in the United States that's under 18 was going to go up by X million. Now, there were, but where do you get the juvenile super predators? Well, you go to Delinquency in a Birth Cohort that was published in 1972, where they said that 6% of the boys were responsible for 70% of the police contacts. And that must mean they're juvenile super predators. Actually, a lot of that was for truancy and other things that didn't take too many prisoners. But where do you get the 210,000? Look, there were only 100,000 kids of all sorts locked up at the base in 1995. Well, he made a couple of mathematical assumptions that were pretty new. He took the entire youth population, but the arrest rate of people under 13 is 0. Well, he had as many people under 5 in 2010 as he had over 13. Yes. Okay, that was the first problem, and that was a big problem. The second problem is that when you looked at the relationship between arrest rates for things like homicide arrests and total youth population, if there was any correlation at all over time since the 1970s, it was negative. It was only as the juvenile population was shrinking from 1985 to 1990 that the number of youth homicide arrests was going up. And this all started before it was published. I was saying, now, what should we make of this? And I said, the notion that you could predict 200,000 more super predators here suggested to me that Professor Dooley might be suffering from mad cow disease. And one of his supporters said, "Oh, I know this man, this is all," so I did the math. But it's that kind of stuff. So that's not simply injecting my values. It is participating in the debate by trying to make the debate hinge on the empirics.
Switching tracks in a little bit of way here, to what would you attribute your success in the academic vein? Is it a work habit? Is it anticipating trends? What would it be?
It's a little hard. First of all, why don't we talk about the major failures first?
Okay.
Because I mean, part of my success has been very lucky in mentors.
Yeah.
With friends like Norval Morris, you have a head start, which is enormously important. A lot of people value my work because people they value my work. Or Edward Levy, after he'd had me in a seminar as a law student, 6 weeks later he came up to me in the library and he said, "You're Zimring, aren't you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, sir." And he looked at me and he said, "Norval Morris tells me you're bright." Well, now Edward Levy was a great deliverer of one-liners. 7 years later, when I was on the Chicago faculty, I was sitting with a visitor. It happened to be Richard Pearl, who I'd gone to high school with before his Prince of Darkness days. And Edward was coming through the bar while we were having a drink, so I stood him up and introduced him to Ed Levy, and I said, "And I'm Frank Zimring." I said, I was a student in one of your classes, and he said, "Oh, I remember," he said, "but you've gained a lot of weight since then." So, Edward is like this. Well, it turns out that there's a little bit of a story that goes with it.
Yeah.
I was the first person ever appointed to the faculty at the University of Chicago directly after getting a degree. It had come up once before in 1936 or 35 when Edward Levy graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, and they made him go get a JSD at Yale before he came back and joined the faculty.
Get the dig in.
So Norval Morris took him out for lunch
Yeah.
in 1966. And he said, "Edward," he was in the middle of the faculty fight on my appointment. He said, "Edward, you know, that year you spent at Yale, was it valuable to you?" He said, "Waste of time." And Norval said, "Thank you for sharing." And back to the faculty. I have a good instinct for topics that are going to become very important, and that helps. And I can work fast, and I can organize things well. That is a necessary but not sufficient condition for things getting widely known. Johnson and I wrote a book called The Next Frontier on the death penalty in Asia, which specialists in the death penalty in Asia get a great deal out of. I don't think you could fill the men's room in any place in this hotel with people at this meeting who've ever read or heard of that work. So I think it was a very successful scholarly effort, and I think it was important research. But that doesn't mean that you win any popularity contests with it. Again, however, one reason why the stuff that I produce doesn't get ignored is because people now tend to value my instincts on what important questions are.
Yeah.
However, there was a book that we were discussing a little bit earlier called An American Travesty on legal responses to adolescent juvenile adolescent sex offending. That didn't have much of an audience when the book was originally published in 2003. And came the Amy Zyla amendments to something called the Adam Walsh Act that was passed in 2006 with essentially lifetime registration requirements for some adjudicated juvenile sex offenders. And it had been the only book on the topic for some years before then, but it became an only book on the topic that got read when the worst case events of a public policy. And the worst case event with juvenile justice is this. When the criminal justice system sneezes in the United States, the juvenile justice system catches cold. Some things are simply imported directly in an unthinking fashion. And the reason the book then became important is because people suddenly realized that the world had changed in ways that what was probably a bad mistake to begin with was about to become a catastrophic mistake.
What do you think are your, or what would you argue would be your sort of signature contributions? Is there sort of a short stack of books that you would point people to sort of get a sense of who you are, your identifying aspects of the scholar?
Yes, but they're not timeless in that sense.
Oh.
You see, The Scale of Imprisonment, when it came out in 1991, was the only resource there that was a preview of coming attractions that nobody had noticed. So I thought it was important, but it's now an antique. The Deterrence book is still a pretty good organization of the field. The Contradictions of American Capital Punishment, one of the reasons why I haven't written another edition of it or another book on capital punishment in the United States is that it seems to me to be a very accurate description of where we are, and it's now a decade later, so it's sort of stood the test of time. The little book, An American Travesty, is an important book, I think. The City That Became Safe, the book on New York City's police effects, turns out also to be a book about the nature of crime and about the multiplicity of ways in which crime can be reduced other than imprisonment, which I think should have a long shelf life. And I'm hoping that When Police Kill will become a defining document on what the issues are, what the significant questions are, and what the facts we know are, and how we can find out better. So, you see, whenever you ask somebody that question and they're still writing, the answer will always be my next book.
Yeah.
That's what keeps us getting up in the morning. There are a number of things that I've written that I'm very happy to have written, that I enjoyed writing, and that I think people can still benefit from reading. So that's nice. And I think in terms of contributions in the topic packages, the juvenile justice stuff, there's a collection of essays called American Juvenile Justice, which I really think is the jurisprudence of juvenile courts, and I hope it has a long shelf life. The City That Became Safe, Contradictions of American Capital Punishment. Then there are books that I would call rhinoceros books. And this is the lady at the zoo asks the zookeeper, tell me, what sex is that rhinoceros? And the zookeeper says to him, Madam, that should only be of interest to another rhinoceros. I've written some books that are only of interest to another rhinoceros. Incapacitation, penal restraint, okay. So a wonderful example of that. Punishment and Democracy. The Next Frontier, the capital punishment in Asia stuff.
Is your crime decline book, would you classify that as a rhinoceros?
No.
Okay.
No. And that's a critique of the rhinoceroses. You see, all of the prominent theories that were out there, including a few of Rick's, were out there by people who had a wonderful idea one afternoon, and then did a simple order correlation. Or who wrote the Roe versus Wade, lagged 20 years, when on the back of a napkin they said, hey, wait a minute. But if you took 1973,
Right.
those guys would be, okay. Well, that's a wonderful idea to have in a bar and grill.
Right.
But that isn't an explanation for a crime decline.
But that didn't seem to have a sustained
Oh,
measure of
yeah,
interest.
it did too.
You-
It did too, but there was a John Donahue still pushing it.
Okay.
And you see, the point is, and one of the reasons it did was a very interesting methodological error. The way in which that hypothesis came up was very simple. Well, what the hell happened 15 or 20 years before
right.
the 90s? Oh, that did. I wonder if...
Sure.
But if that's your methodology, then you've got to choose some other setting to test it.
Right.
Because, of course, the
Right. And so you chose Canada, and then you.
Yeah,
all right,
yeah.
Okay.
But no, that's a good book for people who are wondering how to think about crime.
Oh, okay.
But do I think it will be thoroughly read 15, 20 years from now? I don't know. Maybe not.
Are there any avenues that you had open to you that you didn't pursue, that you kind of regret or kind of have second thoughts about, or are there?
Not really.
No.
I mean, one reason why, particularly in the last 25 years, I've written so many books, is that I've had time and resources. I don't write grant proposals.
Oh.
I don't.
Yeah.
No.
Huh.
And so what that means is that whenever I've wanted to be able to write something, I've been able to write it.
Huh.
That's really very nice. And it means that it's very difficult to say that there are roads not taken with all of those opportunities to do it. It took me 2 years to do When Police Kill. It took me 2.5 years after the Great American Crime Decline to write The City That Became Safe. And I got a chance to go to NYU for 9 months of that. So, with all those opportunities, there aren't a lot of roads not taken. Now, if I could have been a great soprano, that would be a reason for regret, but I don't sing.
What kinds of advice would you offer to young PhD type students or aspiring academics in terms of?
Well, a lot depends on who they are and why they're doing it.
Yeah.
I just had a hot dog at a casino because I needed a quick lunch before this interview with one of our PhD students at Berkeley, Johan Kohler, and I'm probably going to take over chairing his dissertation, and it will be a very good dissertation. And we're talking about whether he wants to be a law professor or wants to be a professor of criminal justice at a place like Maryland. He's going to be very good. And I think he should probably be at a place like Maryland in criminal justice. I think I could have, if I'd moved to Penn in 1973 or 4, it would have been, and the offer was outstanding, to co-direct the Wolfgang Center. And I had a PhD student, Joe Ligon, who did finish there in 1976, and be on the Penn Law faculty. That would have been a more criminological training orientation, although the place then had a lot of trouble in the late 70s without that. I think that the life I've had in Berkeley has been wonderful, good fun. I exercise now regularly. Most of my bad habits are history, and that's one of the reasons I'm still on the planet, you know. So you have to be able to take care of yourself, and for me that means if you're enjoying yourself, you're taking care of yourself. I don't, oh, you should have been a novelist. I'd probably be a dreadful novelist. I am so enormously glad and feel so enormously lucky that something like When Police Kill was waiting to be written and that I could write it.
Huh.
This is the point at which you wonder whether you have new ideas or skills that are still irreplaceable.
Yeah.
And I wonder that a lot less having finished that book in a year and 9 months than I wondered it before. So it's hard to say. What I'd like is 20 more years.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the problem is that application is pending, but it's up there in the Department of Wish Fulfillment and Urban Renewal, where we all tend to live.
In your Sutherland address, you remarked kind of whimsically in a bit of a way, a little bit of a quip about rechanging the name of the ASC to the Society of People Who Study Crime. I'm wondering what your thoughts on the state of the field are at this point in terms of its development, its maturation.
There's good news and bad news,
Okay.
you know. There are a lot of bright young people. There are job opportunities everywhere. The problem is that criminologists are followers much more than they're leaders. They don't find new things so much as they convene around topics that have grown old and interesting, and they tend to be doing work on subjects that other people are doing work on, so that they can go to meetings and it'll be well attended. But there are 2 sessions at these meetings that I've found on police use of lethal force. The session that I'm going to, Colin Lofton organized. I've known Colin for 40 years. And that tells you something about both of our ages.
Yeah.
The topic has been important, and the death toll has been high forever. There were some very good people in the American Criminological Society studying police use of fatal force in the 70s and early 80s. Lawrence Sherman, William Geller, James, come on now,
Fife.
Fife, yes. Fife's 1983 article was the last major thing done. And then and I asked Larry, and Larry said, "Oh, we thought we'd solved the problem." Oh boy, okay. There's nobody among the young, so it caught the society by surprise. And yet, the number of people who are interested in queer theory and street policing, or restorative justice approaches in Midwestern cities is rather large. Part of that is true of any kind of academic discipline. But part of that is also because there is not a lot of intellectual leadership at the top. Thank God we gave Bob Merton a prize maybe 10 years ago when he was 89.
Yep.
The field doesn't have Bob Mertons.
Yeah. Huh.
And it suffers from
Yeah.
that. It suffers badly from that. And good values without good research or strong intellectual and critical leadership isn't going to be enough for a country like this.
Is there any solution to that? What would it look like, or is it?
Yeah,
Is this just an
all we
institutional
need
thing?
is 10 good men. That's not just institutional.
No.
That's one of the reasons, you see, law professors are a funny bunch. They're very smart.
Yeah.
And they're very smart because they get job offers because they were first in their class. Now they have all kinds of terrible life crises because that doesn't mean that they're really academics or researchers. So they're just there because they're very smart. So I have this notion of an obituary in the Times. Joe Smith, law professor, 89, was very smart. Yes, but what did you do and what does that, okay, so that's an issue, but there are very bright people. One of the problems is that there aren't a lot of natural intellectual leaders going into criminology. And that is also true, there are not a lot of intellectuals in the operating stuff. Bill Bratton is a smart guy, not quite as smart as Jack Maples was, but he was smart enough to know how smart Jack Maples was and put him in charge. But he was the exception rather than the rule. Good politicians become police chiefs, but they can't be leaders either. And our attorneys general have not been great leadership folks. Crime and criminal justice are more important in America than in many other countries. But I'm not sure that the cream of the crop go into the business. And what can we do about that? Hope that things get better.
Okay. Anything that you think that the field really has a pressing need to contemplate or engage?
Well, first of all, leading indicators of serious problems. Instead of going back and doing study commissions like the NAS, Law and Social Science Commission, but what's on the horizon? And I'd love to see a commission on what we're not studying, but we should be studying.
Okay.
And sort of future of criminal justice stuff. That would be a very good thing for the society to get to do. Although the people that I think I'd want to have on that panel are all not getting any younger. That's probably because all my friends are getting older. But it would be important, and I think it would be necessary. Because when our students get ideas for dissertations of specialities from what was good that was published 10 years ago, we are not making new waves in the ocean of knowledge.
I'm through with sort of the formalities of this.
I've told you more than I know.
Is there anything that I've maybe left out that you think that needs to be included? Well,
it's an interesting opportunity to both look back and look sideways.
Yes.
And a project that I'll get more interested in pursuing.
Yeah.
So send me some links.
Will do. Well, I appreciate your time here.
Okay.